Welcome to the Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Tonight, we're going to be talking with Dr. Alan Rhoda. Hey there, Dr. Rhoda.
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming on. Dr. Rhoda has published a paper called The Philosophical Case for Open Theism, and it's a very good paper, very clear. And what's really exciting is that he published that several years ago, and since then he's thought more and reflected on it. And so tonight you're going to hear him update that paper, maybe make some new points that he didn't make in the original, and these points are stronger than what he originally wrote. So I'm really excited to dig in, and let's begin. So what is it that you're trying? I mean, the title gives us some indication, but maybe you can say a little bit more, elaborate just a bit. Like, what are you trying to show in the paper?
Yeah. The gist of it is I'm just trying, well, as the title says, to give a philosophical case for open theism. So I'm not looking to exegete any passages of scripture, to say, here's what the Bible teaches or anything like that. I'm just saying, what are the core claims of open theism, and can we make at least a reasonable case that these claims are true? And I think we can. The way I set it up, I contrast open theism with kind of the two main kind of types of, I guess, non-open theism, for lack of a better label, or one camp is going to be what I refer to as theistic determinism. And the other group, for lack of a better label, this is clunky, I just call it non-open free will theism. The free will means you affirming a libertarian view of freedom. So we're not deterministic, but we don't take the view that the future is open-ended from God's from God's perspective. So I'm trying to kind of make it or a three-way fight, as it were, between these three camps.
But you look at theistic determinism first, and you say it has these problems, and then you're going to look at the non-open free will theism and say it has the following problems. And so the position left standing is open theism. Is it kind of like an argument from elimination?
I think that's certainly a way to frame it. It may help here to just go into the dialectic. First, open theism, it's like right there in the label, it's a form of theism. By that, I basically mean that there is a unique and necessarily existent being who is personal. We'll call this being God, and this being is maximally perfect, omniscient, omnipotent, etc. And all other beings in some way depend on this being, on God, for their existence. I think it's just kind of the core claim of monotheism. All the views I'm going to be considering here are going to agree on that. Future contingency. This is the idea. And here I'll be focusing on the idea that some creatures have libertarian freedom, and that means a kind of freedom that's indeterministic. It's not compatible with determinism. Future contingency is the idea that the future is, at least in some respects, is causally open. There are multiple. We think of a future as an extension of the actual past and present. Then we could say that if the future is causally open, then there are multiple causally possible futures.
So kind of the way I guess I would think of that, like in a picture, would be like an arrow that has multiple branches, say.
Yeah.
And so the part that they all share, that's like our actual past. But now, like at this point where the branches begin, each one is really a possible future. They all have the same past, but each one could be actual.
Yes, that's a great way to explain it. The third point here, I'm calling it EC incompatibility. That's maybe not entirely clear what that means, but the E stands for epistemic, which means having to do with knowledge, and the C for causal. So the idea is about EC incompatibility, as I spell it out here. It's impossible for the future to be epistemically settled in any respect in which it is causally open. So what does that mean? For the future to be epistemically settled means that, it's just like what you have on the traditional view of the foreknowledge of God, that there is a specific way the future is going to go from here on out, right? The entire course of history is sort of infallibly known by God. So there's no doubt in God's mind, as it were, how things are going to play out moving forward. Okay, so if that's the true, then we would say the future is epistemically settled.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, it's not going to be settled in that sense for us, but we're finite creatures. We don't know a lot of stuff. But the idea behind a lot of, behind all of kind of the non-open future views is that there is sort of a fact of the matter about how the future is going to go exhaustively. And God, being omniscient, knows all truths. And so God knows that. Right. And so the future is epistemically closed or settled from God's perspective. What I'm going to be arguing with this EC incompatibility is that, well, if the future were settled, then it could not also be causally open. In other words, future contingency and foreknowledge are incompatible.
You can't have the future being epistemically settled and it being causally open. Those are incompatible. That's the point.
That's the claim I want to make. And it's because open theists accept that claim, and they accept, number two, that there are future contingents, that we conclude, number four, that the future is epistemically open, not just for us as finite creatures, but open for anyone, open for God. It is not possible, if there are future contingents, for anyone to infallibly know the future as a fully determinate and settled fact.
All right, so now we have a helpful picture that compares these three views that you discussed in the paper. And with respect to the tenets that you just laid out, here's what each would affirm and each would deny.
Yeah, so from the previous slide, you see that the open theist is going to affirm all of those views. We affirm future contingency. We affirm the incompatibility of future contingency with an epistemically settled future. And so therefore we conclude, number four, that the future is epistemically open. Both of the other groups of views, the theist determinist and all the views that fall under the rubric of non-open free will theism, deny the epistemic openness of the future. They hold to kind of the traditional view of God's foreknowledge. There is an exact, precise way the future is going to go in all the details from now until kingdom come, and God knows how it's going to play out. So because they reject that, the number four there, and because four is a logical consequence of both two and three, they're going to have to reject one of those two claims. And so the theistic determinist maintains the future is epistemically settled by typically accepting that there is an incompatibility here, but they're going to then deny future contingency. And they're going to make the claim that, well, God is the ultimate sufficient cause of everything. So everything is kind of ultimately determined by God. Maybe not directly, but perhaps indirectly. But all the kind of non-open free will views, they don't want to give up future contingency, so they're going to hold on to that. That's part of the free will theism part. But they don't want to buy into an epistemically open future, so they've got to try to argue for the compatibility of future contingency with an epistemically settled future.
Okay, so theistic determinism is going to deny two. Mm-hmm. But in the paper, you offer a defense of two. So let's begin talking about why you think 2 is true, the future contingency part.
Okay, yeah. I'm going to offer 4 kind of arguments for future contingency. I don't claim necessarily that any of these arguments is individually decisive, but I think cumulatively they make a pretty strong case and show that it's, at the very least, that it's reasonable to affirm future contingency. And if that's reasonable, then it's reasonable to deny theistic determinism. So the first point has to do with just information that comes from physics, quantum indeterminism. It looks like a lot of quantum level events are just fundamentally indeterministic. If you think of like the phenomena of radioactive decay, we say, this particle has or this, like the type of substance, like uranium has a half-life of such and such a number of years. And all we're saying with that is, we don't know when the next decay is going to happen. We can't predict that. All there is just a distribution of probabilities. And over a span of time, a certain percentage, like half of this is going to decay. Of course, there are deterministic interpretations of quantum mechanics, but they all seem to be a little bit more complex. You have to appeal to some kind of hidden variables or kind of bloat the ontology tremendously with like the many worlds interpretation. Direct experience. When you engage in conscious deliberation, you're like you're walking, like you're hiking through a forest. You don't have any particular place you need to get to. Say, you're just exploring. You come to a fork in the road, and you might stand there for a few seconds considering your options. Well, in that scenario, you have this experience of, deliberation. What's the pros and cons of taking this route? What's the pros and cons of that route? And you feel like you have it in your power to do either of the 2 options. I can do option A and I can do option B, and it's I who am the ultimate arbiter or the decider of what happens. And I think we all have this kind of experience, especially when we engage in conscious, focused deliberation. We just feel like, yeah, I'm free right now. I'm not just acting on habit. Doesn't seem to be anything in my subconscious that's, driving me one way or the other. I feel like I have, it's really up to me. And that, again, that's not a proof, but still, the mere fact that something seems to us to be the case is evidence that it is the case. The person who wants to argue against it has kind of the burden of proof there. The third point has to do with moral responsibility. And here I'm going to appeal to the principle from Immanuel Kant that ought implies can. This strikes me as incredibly intuitive. And I know there are lots of philosophers who hold a compatibilist view of human freedom who are going to deny it at some level or in some way. But the rationale behind the principle seems to me that if my choices are determined, my actions was just the causal outcome of all of the forces that are of a bunch of chains of causation that originate outside of me and that just happen to come together and flow through my psychology in a certain way. Mm-hmm. So I'm really just kind of the locus at which all of these forces meet and produce a result. I'm not really to blame for this, for this bad thing I did. It's the environment that made me do it, or my genes made me do it, or God made me do it. God made me this way, sort of thing, or some combination of factors. And I can always, if determinism is right, I can always deflect my personal responsibility onto everything else and say, it's not really me. It's not my fault. And that seems right to me. I think if we're to have genuine moral responsibility, there's got to be what Robert Kane refers to as self-forming actions, where we are kind of just the ultimate, where we make a contribution that's simply not determined by anything else.
Yeah.
And moving on to problem 4, why is there moral evil? And if an all good, all powerful God, has a motive for preventing moral evil because he's all good and presumably has the power to do so, why does he allow it? And the traditional response has been to invoke, a free will theodicy here, to say, well, it's a really, really good thing that there be creatures who are free in an, indeterministic sense, because this gives them a kind of, autonomy to really, to enter into relationships that are genuine and loving, and and these kind of relationships, can be argued just wouldn't be possible if all of our behavior was just the resultant effect of the causal history impinging upon us. We would be in effect kind of like the puppets of the cosmos. Even if we didn't feel ourselves to be such, we would in fact be such. So the theodicy says God wants creatures with free will, with moral freedom, because of the various goods that free will enables. But because this free will is inherently indeterministic, God cannot create the beings with significant moral freedom and at the same time have a guarantee that they never misuse that freedom. If he were to always step in to prevent people from misusing their freedom, that would effectively take away their freedom. They wouldn't really have significant moral freedom. So God has to sort of step aside and allow people to do bad things, to behave badly. But that's justified because it's necessary for this really, good thing. But if you take the view of the theistic determinist, you can't give that theodicy. You seem to run into the problem that if God is the ultimate sufficient cause of everything that happens, then it follows that God is also the ultimate sufficient cause of every instance of moral evil. So, God doesn't maybe cause it directly, but he's, in some sense, he sets up the causal matrix that ensures that we will ourselves cause moral evil. And so it's the ultimate sufficient cause of that. If God is so all-controlling, it sure seems like God could have, had he wanted to, created a world where everybody, in a compatibilistic sense of freedom, always did the right thing. Well, why wouldn't God do that? Well, the only answer that seems to be is, well, there must be some greater good that we can't fathom, that God really, really likes, that necessitates a whole lot of creaturely moral evil. But then that leads to another problem, because if there's some greater good that God thinks that necessitates a lot of creaturely moral evil, it seems to conflict with our moral intuitions. Namely, I think most of us have this strong sense that moral evil is categorically bad. In fact, there's a verse in Romans where St. Paul has the question, shall we do evil that good may result? And he says, kind of, no way. So the idea is that moral evil, almost always, the world would have been better off had moral evils not occurred. But if that's how we tend to think about moral evil, and if God's view is that, well, no, we got these greater goods that actually necessitate all this moral evil, then there's a tension, or a conflict actually, between God's understanding of the good and our understanding of the good. So you can play the mystery card here or the theistic skepticism, but because of this conflict between human moral intuitions and God's motivations, playing the skeptic card is actually going to push in the direction of moral skepticism. Well, God's got to have the right understanding of the good, and if our understanding conflicts with God's, then we really don't know what we're talking about when we talk about goodness. And then how can we really say God is good?
Okay, so what you just did was gave a defense for 2 there in the chart.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would mean that, if the points that you just made are successful in defending 2, then now theistic determinism would be off the table. So now
And that
let's
would,
move on to 3 here. So EC incompatibility means that the future being epistemically settled is incompatible with the future being causally open. That's
yeah.
the point, right? And so the open theist wants to agree with that incompatibility.
Yeah, if you look at the dialectic between these 3 types of views, it's interesting to note that if you look at church tradition, like the history of the church, there's certainly a long tradition that has wanted to affirm future contingency, right? The idea of free will goes, way back in the church fathers and stuff. There's also a pretty long tradition that has wanted to affirm the incompatibility claim, especially, like from the late Augustine on, and after, in the wake of, his debates over the Pelagian issue and stuff. Some Christians have gone in that deterministic direction. And there's not a lot of people in tradition who have wanted to take the epistemic openness idea. There's a few people in the 13th and 14th century that are, I think, probably the earliest clear advocates. But what's interesting is 4 follows from 2 and 3, and you can find people in the tradition that endorse 2 and people in the tradition that endorse 3. So the open theist just kind of takes those 2 sides of the tradition and puts them together.
Okay.
Whereas the other views, are going to stick with the idea of the future is epistemically settled. And so they're going to have to take issue with the parts of the tradition that, either deny future contingency or deny the incompatibility. So there's a sense in which we're all having to kind of pick and choose parts of the tradition, which ones we're willing to affirm and which ones, we have to kind of say, no, that's not where we should go. So where we're at now, if my argument for 2 has been any good, then that leaves theistic determinism off the table. And so it's just a question, okay, open theism versus non-open free will theism, in the whole family of views that fall under that rubric. My next step in the argument is to try to argue for the incompatibility claim. And if I can do that successfully, then that's going to wipe out, or exclude from contention all of those views.
Yeah, so this one's going to take some time. So let's jump into it. How do you defend the incompatibility between those 2 claims about the future's epistemically settled and the future's causally open? It seems like those are incompatible. How do you defend that?
Yeah. Okay. So this is going to be a multi-step argument. The first stage, I'm going to just make some general observations about, what future contingency entails and what the resolution of a future contingent looks like. Then I'm going to, use some of the lessons from that to present an argument against molinism. We're gonna set that one off the table then, and then I'm going to turn my sights on all of the other views, like the simple foreknowledge view, aka dependence, aka optimism, and the timeless knowledge view, and so forth, that fall under the non-open free will theism rubric. Let's first consider what all these views have in common, right? If you think the future is epistemically settled, God has, this traditional view of divine foreknowledge, then it seems to me you're committed to the idea that there exists, in some sense, a complete true story of creation history, and that this story has existed, in some sense, from at least the moment of creation. Why do I say that? Well, if you think God eternally or perhaps in time, has exhaustive foreknowledge of all of creation history, well, knowledge entails truth, right? So if the future is epistemically settled, then there's got to be not just a complete known story of the future, but a complete true story of the future. There's this static and complete description of all of history that is just somehow kind of there right from the beginning. And God knows that. He has all that information. Since he's omniscient, he knows all that there is to know. And so he's going to, know that's complete true story. What I want to say is, if there are future contingents, then this story, since it describes the entire course of history, is going to have to contain lots of information about the resolution of future contingents, right? Every indeterministic event, the course of events could go this way and it could go that way. There's going to be a determinate fact of the matter as to, which branch a reality takes. And so that's going to be part of that complete true story. So, for example, every time there's a free choice, there's going to be, a truth of the sort like, S freely chooses A over B at time T. That tells us, exactly what happened at that time. So we're going to have to build lots of information into this complete true story that spells out how every future contingency played out. So the question then, if this complete true story has all this determinate information about how every future contingency throughout history is resolved, where does that information come from? How does it get into the story? To change the question slightly, where would it need to come from? And here I'm going to argue that there's only one place it can come from, really. It has to come from the actual occurrences of the future contingent events. All right, so let's use a concrete example here. I know this is kind of an artificial example, but suppose I'm making or about to make a libertarian free choice between chocolate and vanilla ice cream. Before my choice, and here we're talking not necessarily a temporal before, but in the order of explanation, the information state concerning my choice is indeterminate. Okay, suppose where my risks meet. Okay, that's the moment right before the choice, right? Mm-hmm. And I have these two options. I can, say chocolate over here and vanilla over here.
Yeah.
And at this moment, before my choice, the information state of the universe concerning my choice is indeterminate, because, well, let's say it's both of these options are really possible. They're causally possible for me. I really could choose this and I really could choose this. And neither is actual. Okay, that's important. Okay, we shouldn't think, in the order of explanation, right? Absent my choice, there is no fact of the matter as to, that I choose chocolate or that I choose vanilla. It is my choice that creates the fact, right? That's why I say on the next line that, after my choice, again, in the order of explanation, the information state becomes determinate, right? Say I choose chocolate, then, as a result of the choice, one option becomes sort of actual, right? That's the one that remains. The other one I have rejected, and so it's no longer in the realm of causal possibility. Having chosen chocolate, I cannot now undo that choice and have chosen a vanilla instead, right? I can't reverse time and replay the choice, right? That particular option is no longer on the table. Now maybe in the next minute I can make a new choice and choose vanilla this time, but that's a separate future contingency. So I want to say is what happens when I make my choice is I introduce new information into the system. And this new information is what transforms the indeterminacy into, the indeterminate state into one that is determinate. And it does this simply by excluding all the options but one. Here I want to make clear that the information, say that I freely choose chocolate over vanilla at time t, that information is ontologically dependent on my actual choice. Why do I say ontologically dependent? Because I want to say that particular information, as to, how that contingency was resolved, would not have existed if I had not made the specific choice that I did.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's my choice for chocolate over vanilla that brings that information into being, as opposed to the contrary piece of information that I could have brought into being otherwise. Had I chosen vanilla over chocolate, then there would be a different, fact that would be part of the complete true story.
That seems right. That future contingent depends on your choice.
Yeah, and most of the versions of non-open free will theism actually accept that. They agree with that view. Like the simple foreknowledge view. Yeah, that's the whole point behind it. Or the other, I guess the name that's kind of fashionable for it is, or becoming fashionable, is the dependence view, right? That's just the dependence view, right? The content of God's foreknowledge concerning the resolution of future contingents depends on, or is grounded in, or is brought about by the actual occurrences of those events.
Yeah. Okay. So let's keep going. Then I'm going to switch to the next slide. Like I said, I'm buying all this so far. I say that because at this point I'm not an open theist. So I'm looking at, is there a point at which I've become like, well, is this the point where I object? But so
Yeah.
far I'm in.
Okay. So anyway, I'm going to make, perhaps a controversial claim now, but I think it follows from the argument. I'm going to say, because determinate information about a free choice is ontologically dependent on the actual choice, we can conclude at this point that molinism is false. Yeah, and I know the molinists in the audience aren't going to like it at this point, but I don't think they've got a way out. Okay, if you accept that the determinate information about the resolution of future contingents has to come from the event itself, well, molinism denies that. Right? The molinist says that determinate information about future contingencies is ontologically independent of those events. How do we know this? Well, it's based on God's middle knowledge, right? When God's considering, on the molinist scheme, right, he has this a choice to make, right? It moves him from his middle knowledge to his free knowledge, where he's selecting a feasible world to actualize. Well, that world is a complete total history, right? Fully specified. As he's contemplating these feasible worlds, he knows exactly how each of those respective worlds is going to play out without ever actualizing it. The only thing he's adding is he's saying, okay, what choice am I going to make? Which of these total histories is going to come about? But the information about the future contingencies in each of those worlds is already fully determinate, because that comes from the middle knowledge that is already fully determinate, right? Like if you think about his middle knowledge, it always says, if placed in certain circumstances, that so-and-so would freely do X. It doesn't give us that open question type of information, that, well, would he or wouldn't he? The molinist idea of middle knowledge is saying it's always determinate what you're going to do in a given situation, which means that the information's never been ontologically dependent on your actual choice. But that, I'm going to say, rules out future contingency. That the molinism, despite its protestations to the contrary, entails fatalism. And I can elaborate on this a little bit. I mean, I'll throw a shout out here to Phil Swenson. I think you had him on.
Yeah, you don't have to elaborate a bunch. I can point the viewer to the interview that I did. I don't know if you saw it or not, but I did an interview with Philip Swenson, and he gave this argument against molinism. That was the whole interview, was just on his argument against molinism. Mm-hmm. And he uses the fixity of the independent like you're talking about. Yeah. So yeah, you can say more about it I'll just point people to that interview for more depth.
Yeah, it's a good interview, and I think he's exactly right on that point. This whole idea of the fixity of the independent is something that even molinists have to agree to, because their own system kind of implies that independent information constrains choice. After all, that's what middle knowledge does. The middle knowledge is, pre-volitional and contingent, non-natural information. It doesn't come from God's nature. It doesn't come from creation. It doesn't come from God's will. It doesn't come from anywhere. It's completely independent of God. And yet somehow it constrains what an almighty, omnipotent God can do. And to press the point just one more step, suppose there was independent information that specified exactly what free choice I'm going to make next, right? And let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that it's still a future contingent, whether I make that choice or not. Well, now we're going to be led to a contradiction. Like we have independent information that specifies that I choose chocolate at this particular time. Well, if we're supposing that it's still a future contingency, whether I choose chocolate or vanilla, then it's up to me whether I choose chocolate or vanilla. So I could just choose vanilla, but then I would have created a fact, Alan chooses vanilla over chocolate at time t, that conflicts with this independent information. So now I've created a contradiction. The other way of looking at it is, if this independence specifies what I'm going to choose independently of my actually choosing it, then either I have the power to overwrite that information or not. If I do have the power to overwrite it, like say it specifies I'm going to choose chocolate and I do vanilla. Well, now we just gone against our initial assumption that the information was independent. If I can overwrite the information by making the opposite choice, then it was never independent of my choice to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
So we either get a contradiction by supposing that there's some fact out there, some truth that is both dependent and independent of my choice in the same sense, right? They're both ontologically independent and ontologically dependent. Or we're saying I've got the ability to make a choice that would create a contradiction, right? It's true independently of me that I'm going to choose this, and I choose the opposite. So either way, we're led to a contradiction. So this is not something that is doable. If the information is ontologically independent of your choice, it constrains your choice. And if it specifies exactly what you're going to do, then you cannot do otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't have any pushback on that. Okay, so this would take molinism off the table, which is just like one view within that broad umbrella of non-open free will theism.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then let's keep going. So molinism is off the table now. What about other forms of non-open free will theism? Like
all the other, good. All the other forms of non-open free will theism, in one way or another, I think do say what we ought to say, which is namely that determinate information about future contingents comes from the actual occurrences of those events. If you want to, be an anti-fatalist, if you want to have future contingency, that's exactly what you should say, right? But the problem I see with all of these kind of non-open future views is, returns to this idea that there's this complete true story, right? That's sort of there from the get-go, right? From the moment of creation on. And I want to say that future contingency is incompatible with that story kind of just existing there as a completed totality, as it were. There can be no sort of eternally existent complete true story of creation if there is future contingency. And I base this on the idea, as I've already made the observation, that when a future contingency is resolved, that adds new information. There's something that we go from an open question to a settled fact. We go from indeterminacy, right, two things are possible, neither is actual, to one is actual and the other is no longer possible, right? We've changed the information state of reality as a result of the choice. So we're adding new information. Moreover, future contingencies chain into each other, right? Like if I'm about to choose between chocolate and vanilla ice cream, okay, well, that's great. But I would never have ever had that choice if other choices hadn't been made earlier on. For example, like most obviously say, if my parents had never gotten together, then I wouldn't have existed to be able to make that particular choice, right? And if their parents had, and their parents, and on and on and on, right? There's a history is a chain of future contingencies being resolved at the other, and what options are available at any given point in time are going to depend how the contingencies were resolved earlier on, right? And each of those contingencies is adding new information. And so what I'm saying is, because of this completed story of creation cannot exist from the beginning. It has to be built up sequentially over time as these contingencies are progressively resolved.
Okay, so maybe this is the point where I need you to help me see why it has to be built up over time. It sounds like what you're saying is that those future contingents become true at the moment of the actual occurrence of the event.
I would agree with that there are some things that become true that were not true previously as a result of the new information that each future contingency adds.
But even though the events haven't occurred yet, nonetheless, they will occur. So those future contingents, they do depend on the actual occurrence of the event. But I don't know why it matters that the actual occurrence of the event hasn't happened yet. It will happen. So it seems like I've got all the information I need kind of packed in at the moment of creation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this will come up a little bit on the next slide. So I'm imagining that the natural rejoinder that I expect to get from like a simple foreknowledge proponent or a timeless knowledge proponent is they'll say, okay, I'll grant you that there's got to be kind of a sequence of moments in this, complete true story that it can't, at least for explanatory reasons, there's a sense in which it can't all just be there at the same time. That certain parts of the story depend on what happened to earlier parts of the story. So you got to, the story has to be written in sequence, right, as it were. But they'll say that doesn't have to be a temporal sequence.
Mm-hmm.
We can think of these as just a series of logical moments that could all kind of be wrapped up in one temporal moment or one atemporal moment, if you imagine a timeless God. And so the last step to my argument is I want to say this isn't going to work. These moments actually have to be temporally distinct. And the way I press this is I say, well, think about the idea of logical moments for a bit. What does it mean to have a strictly logical series, like of steps, like say the steps of a mathematical proof? In that kind of series, I want to say each step has to be mutually compatible with all of the other steps, right? If you had some step in a mathematical proof where you suddenly introduce something that's inconsistent with everything that went before, well, the whole proof fails. It's you don't have a logical sequence in it anymore. You've broken the logical sequence, right? So what I want to say is because in the resolution of future contingents, we get in this new information that changes an indeterminate state into a determinate state, that the kind of the before and after sides of the future contingency are mutually incompatible. So it cannot be a purely logical sequence, because if they're incompatible, then the two information states have to be realized at different moments, different times. So, for example, just to try to clarify this again, right? Before, again, explanatorily prior, right? It's an open question, right?
Mm-hmm.
Two things are possible, neither is actual. That is incompatible with the after state, where one thing is actual and the other isn't possible, right? The choice, the one state, neither is actual. It's indeterminate what's going to happen. In the after state, it's determinate what's going to happen, right? So, it can't both be the case that neither is actual and one of them is actual, right? That's inconsistent, right? Those two states can't be realized concurrently, right? It can't both be the case that both options are really possible and that only one of them remains possible because the other one is no longer it was rejected. It's no longer causally possible for me to go back and undo my choice, right? So I'm going to say the before and after states of the choice are mutually incompatible with each other. It can't both be an indeterminate open question and a determinately settled fact. And so because of that, the before and after have to refer to different times. The sequence has to be temporal. It can't be merely logical. And so what we get is this idea of this story being gradually built up over time as the future contingencies are resolved. Well, that's exactly what open theists believe, right? That's open theism. All of the other views, or at least like the except for molinism, all the other type subtle future views say that this story has been there from the get-go. But it can't all be there from the get-go if it's been built up step by step in temporal sequence. There were times, early in that sequence when the whole story was not there.
Yeah. Okay. I'll have to think more about this. But yeah, there's something going for this argument for sure.
I'd like to think so. So let me see. I think there's one more slide.
Okay.
If you want to move to that, we can. So I've argued that if there are future contingencies, then this, complete true story of creation, it is progressively being written as contingencies are sequentially resolved. And that's how the open theist views the matter, right? As we make choices, things that were indeterminate become determinate and therefore become, and it's only at that point that, it becomes, say, part of the story of creation that is being written. Up to that point, you've got kind of like a choose your own adventure book, and what's going to happen next? Well, there's no determinate fact of the matter as to what's going to happen next until the choice is made. Once it's made, okay, that's part of the story now. That part's written. And okay, what's going to happen next? So I want to say this complete true story cannot exist independently of the actual occurrences of future contingent events, and that rules out molinism. And I've argued that it cannot exist in completed form at the outset. And that's going to rule out all the other varieties of, what I call non-open free will theism. And so between those 2 points, I think we have a defense of EC incompatibility, and combine that with the prior defense of future contingency, and we've got a case for open theism.
Question is, why does this whole thing matter? Did you want to add anything?
Well, yeah. So at least the particular argument I've laid out is going to have some pretty significant implications for other areas of metaphysics. I think the more like general discussion about the free will and foreknowledge problem and uh, uh, having, say, open theism as a live option on the table, I think that matters because as Christian theists, if there's an internal inconsistency in our theology, that's a problem, right? Because that means that there's something, well, that the system, the package we have is necessarily false, right? And we don't want that, right? So it's important that Christians think about this issue because, you know, the compatibility or incompatibility of freedom and foreknowledge, and because it's going to force us to make some theological adjustments one way or the other. If we can find a way to show that these things are compatible, great, we've got a certain set of options on the table. But if they're incompatible, then we've got a different set of options. And it's good to have options, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to be totally forced, totally be backed into a corner if you can help it. You always want to have, well, here's another thing I could say. And so in terms of the dialectic we looked at earlier, where you have open theism, theistic determinism, and, kind of the whole, like, the group of views I call non-open free will theism, and, how they stand on those three positions of future contingency, EC incompatibility, and the epistemic openness. It's kind of like necessary that open theism at least be at the table, because otherwise there would be this logical gap, as it were, in the possible positions that one could hold. To really explore all the options that a theist might have, we kind of have to look at all the different possible combinations of answers you could give on those different claims, and then debate and see which ones are going to be tenable at the end of the day. So it's a discussion that's worth having, because we want to root out inconsistencies in our theology as best we can, and that's one way we're going to do that. Last point I'll make, though, is I think there's one sense in which this debate doesn't matter, and that's wherever you come out on this. I don't see that it's while it may have issues of inconsistency at some point, all of us are trying to do our best as individuals to make sense of the world as best we can, to make sense of the Bible, to make sense of church tradition, to make sense of the philosophical arguments. And at the end of the day, we're not all going to come out in the same place, but that's okay. We can all be brothers and sisters in Christ, and collectively continue the dialogue in a friendly and congenial way as we all seek truth together.
Yeah, thank you for coming on, and I'll leave the viewer with this. So I've done an interview with Philip Swenson arguing against molinism. I have done an interview with David Hunt on arguing for simple foreknowledge, or at least that simple foreknowledge does give God some providential control. And now we have this interview. So my hope is to continue to kind of build a set of interviews out so that you can explore the different views. And something that came up quite a bit in this discussion is determinism and free will. And I have a whole playlist of videos on free will, looking at compatibilism and libertarianism and so on. So there's plenty there to explore. I encourage you to go check it out, and we'll see you next time.